All right. So we are continuing on talking about ways for you guys to bring in potentially, six figures of additional revenue for work you are already doing. So we're talking all about RPM, so remote patient monitoring. And we're talking about the new 2026 codes. We talked about those in part one, so the last episode. So if you haven't listened to it, go check it out. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about how you actually implement that, as well as some case examples of practices who actually have implemented this. And again, could add an additional six figures for work that you are already doing, right? So RPM, just as a refresher, is again remote patient monitoring. So looking at data that patients are taking at home in the office, and then working with the patient to identify if you need to make any medication changes, need to have them come in sooner, or worst comes to worst, if you did see something urgent and they needed to get to the ED, you can help guide that. We are going to talk a little bit about a primary care practice that actually added six figures in revenue, as well as an OBGYN clinic that has used this to better manage high-risk pregnancies. And then we'll do a deep dive on the documentation that you need to evaluate and make sure that you have in place prior to billing this out. So if you haven't listened to the part one episode, highly recommend going to check it out, because that will help you kind of set the framework. Because today we're going to cover a little bit about the business case and kind of the ROI. And I don't have any, vendor recommendations specifically, though I know that there are quite a few out there, but we'll talk a little bit about just the things to think through when you are trying to help identify a vendor who can put these tools so that you can give those to the patients. So before we get started, just a quick refresher on those 4 key RPM codes, because it is important for you to understand these. Again, we went over these last week, but device supply. So again, that's device and the data transfer is at 99454, and that's for the long-term monitoring. So that's 16 plus days over a 30-day period. And then the new code, which is for 2026, that 99445 for short-term monitoring. So that's 2 to 15 days worth of data. And both of these reimburse about $45, $47 per month from Medicare. Obviously, commercial payers are going to depend on who they are, what your payer rates, et cetera. Now, for the management time, right, the time that you are managing these patients, so you've got 2 of those CPT codes, the 99457, which needs greater than 20 minutes of clinical time, which is about $52 per month, and then 99470, which is 10 to 19 minutes of time, which reimburses about half that, so $25, $26 per month. So for a typical patient getting long-term monitoring, and 20 minutes of check-ins, you're looking at, roughly $100 per month, right? And that's going to be kind of some of the math we'll use in some of our examples. And again, these can be used for chronic patients or patients who you need to check, blood pressures, blood sugars, those sorts of things while they're at home, and get that information. Again, if you're having patients scribble them down on paper and and then checking in on what those values are, there's just a few additional steps you need to put into place in order to be able to capture that data, review it, have an MA checking in on the patient, escalating to a physician if you need to manage critical issues, and then documenting all of that, and then obviously dropping the CPT code. So we do have practices who are doing this today. And so we're going to walk through kind of a case study of a typical primary care practice. We're going to call them Main Street Family Medicine just for fun. So, say they are a family practice group. They have 800 patients. They're a larger practice, 800 patients with specific uncontrolled hypertension. So larger practice, and they decide to do a pilot with RPM. So they decide to do a pilot with 50 of those patients. So again, that average reimbursement of $99 per patient per month of those 50 patients who signed up, again, kind of combining those longer term management codes, the 99454 and the 99457. So you're talking, $5,000 per month, or close to 60 grand in additional revenue from just those 50 patients. Now, what are the costs for RPM? So RPM platforms range in how they charge for patient fees. Some do 1% and some do a flat rate per month. So sometimes they'll do $25 per patient per month. that is roughly about 25% of what you would be getting reimbursed. And then, of course, there's the dedicated time to assign an MA or a nurse who can call and kind of be that RPM coordinator. So say they're spending, 5 to 10 hours per week on the program. So they're reviewing charts. I think that's probably on the high side for 50 patients, but they're reading charts. They're reviewing the data that's crossing over from the interface. They're documenting, that they've reviewed it. If they're making any recommendations or changes, any contacts with the patient, they're documenting all of that. So say, you have somebody who's making $30 an hour. That's, potentially, $10,000 to $15,000 per year in labor costs. So not a ton of labor costs. So you've got labor costs, say, of 10 to 15,000. You've got RPM software costs, so of another 10 to 15,000. So we're talking total costs of 30,000. But your revenue is 60. So the net profit is about 30,000 from just those 50 patients. And again, I think that that's on the high side in terms of cost for an MA, meaning I don't think they're truly going to take that many hours per week in order to do that. So those are some of the things you could implement in order to have an MA who's coordinating, picking a vendor who is able to transfer the data and provide the actual devices. And then obviously trialing that with 10 or 15 patients, making sure that those work, the process works, the consents work, the documentation works, and then increasing that to 50 to 100 patients. And at that point, you could be looking at, well into the six figures in terms of annual revenue. And oftentimes you're utilizing these MAs who may have been sitting there or have free time on their hands. So there's minimal incremental FTE increases depending on how many patients you want to implement into the workflow. And again, you can pick one disease state to start with, right? Uncontrolled hypertension. And then obviously expanding that for other disease states. So we're going to talk a little bit about the step-by-step process of how to implement this. So obviously, first and foremost, you're identifying the patients with the disease that you want to monitor at home. And then, of course, it's the consent, right? So physician is going to identify those eligible patients during their routine visits. You're going to have a consent form that you're going to go over with them, have them sign, give them the device, and get them trained. So again, in this example, uncontrolled hypertension would benefit from daily monitoring. So during the visit, the physician's going to explain what RPM is, obtain those verbal consents, documents those orders in the EMR, gets the consent signed by the patient. And that way you're documenting, okay, I'm using RPM for uncontrolled hypertension. I'm asking the patient to monitor blood pressure twice a day for 90 days. And then the MA or RPM coordinator can then call the patient within 40 hours to complete the onboarding. They're going to, explain in detail on how the program works. Obviously, make sure that that written consent is confirmed, and make sure that the devices get to the patient's address, and that you have either videos or a policy and procedure explaining how to use the devices. And again, a lot of vendors will help you with that part. You're going to set the expectations of what they need to do. So in this case, blood pressure twice a day. And that data is going to be automatically sent over to us. And there's different ways that you can view that data in a data dashboard. There's ways for it also to cross over into some EMRs. And then the MA coordinator will let the patient know, I'm going to be monitoring this daily, and I will call you if I see anything concerning. That way you set expectations that they shouldn't expect a phone call unless you see something concerning. Obviously, the MA is going to want to make sure that they're documenting these conversations. Obviously, you're going to use vendors who supply these devices. They oftentimes will ship those blood pressure cuffs directly to the patient's home. Oftentimes, they're already pre-configured. They're ready to use. The patient receives it, and they have easy instructions on how to utilize it. So then once that daily monitoring is started, the MA is then logging into the RPM platform. They're reviewing the data points for however many patients that they have. That shouldn't take more than 30 minutes, an hour max. And then obviously contacting those patients if readings are elevated or if there's a missed reading or a need to make any changes in therapy. And again, those calls should be quick, 5 to 10 minutes. And then every patient will need to have a scheduled monthly check-in call regardless of their data. So that's that 10 to 15 minute call where you review the trends, you ask about medication adherence. And again, the MA is the one who's doing all of this, and then answer any question. You just need to make sure that supervising physician is obviously overseeing all of this. And then at the end of the month, the MA sums up the total time spent on each patient. Again, if that's over 20 minutes, they're going to bill that 99457. If it's that 10 to 19 minutes, then that's going to bill that 99470. Obviously, all of them will have that bill for the device, and that will depend on, again, that number of data points. So 99454 if they did at least 16 days of data transmission. So again, there are RPM vendors that have direct API integration so that the data can flow directly into the EMR, and the MA can review it in that existing workflow. I really, really highly recommend this. Obviously, if you're doing a pilot, you may want to not invest so much time and energy with an API. So you could try it on an external dashboard to start with. And again, there's many different vendors out there. I highly recommend kind of viewing, some of the ones that are already out on the market. All right. So quick pause. If you were listening to this and thinking that eligibility is a major issue for you at the beginning of this year, and it's workflows, it's training, and you're stuck, we have created an eligibility verification training guide. It's a free checklist. It walks through training and the process that we recommend. You can download it at natrevmd.com/eligibility/billing/verification. I know that's a long one, so the link is down below. All right, now let's look at a specialty practice. So OBGYN, you guys know we have a lot of OBGYN clinics that we help support. So I will kind of talk through an example for an OBGYN group who has used this to better manage their high-risk pregnancies, especially those patients with gestational diabetes. A lot of times, these are short-term monitoring protocols or something that is not long-term. And so the new 2026 codes have been very helpful in allowing kind of these shorter duration, shorter time frame billing to be able to be accessible to these practices. So again, let's start with a patient with new onset gestational diabetes, maybe 28 weeks, needed close monitoring for a couple weeks. The practice can now bill that 9945 again for that 14-day monitoring period. And maybe a 99470 for 10 to 19 minutes. Maybe they're not hitting that full 20 minutes, or maybe they're not hitting 16 days worth of data. So you could, be bringing in, that's, $70 in revenue for an episode of care that, again, you're probably having the patient do anyway. You're having those patients collect that information and you're having somebody talk through it, but it's just not something that you've set up a process around, so you're not billing it. So again, if you even manage 20 such patients per year, it's an additional, $1,500 in revenue with minimal incremental costs. And again, you don't have to get fancy here with, an RPM vendor for all of these choices, right? It doesn't have to be this massive thing. You just have to make sure that, you're having data reviewed and then looking at the coding opportunities based on the device and how you're getting that data reviewed and brought over to you. So obviously the workflow and how you bring these patients on, right, it really remains the same regardless. So again, you're wanting to make sure that you're identifying those patients, you're bringing them in for consent, and then you're setting up the process and setting the expectations around monitoring, and that you're monitoring that data on a multiple daily point, right? So if you just look at the data at their next visit, that doesn't count, right? So you've got to have multiple daily data points in order to count for that. All right, some important tips that I do want to bring up around RPM program documentation, because you do want to make sure that, you are documenting all of these visits. You're documenting the daily downloads in terms of the data so that you can justify any sort of audit should you get one. So that core principle is making sure that the MA basically is documenting the work, and that the physicians document that the order and the oversight of those data point reviews. So first, what does that MA need to document for every patient every month. So you obviously need a log, either that's something that's in your EMR or a separate tracking sheet that includes 5 key columns for every single interaction. So obviously the date and the start and stop time. So you need a timestamp. 5 minutes, isn't really enough. You need to say 9:10 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. I did this. The total minutes at the end of the month for that specific patient. So you reviewed the data on these dates. You did it from 9:13 to 9:14. Maybe that was just a minute. And then any phone calls you had, you need to actually put the start time and the end time, and then sum up the actual total number of minutes. And again, that will help you qualify for which one of the CPT codes that you're going to bill. Obviously, you need to be specific about the interaction that you had with a patient, right? Was it a phone call? Was it did they call you? Was it a data review? And then make sure that those are stamped for every single one of the dates that you're actually reviewing the data and discussing this with a patient or the physician. This obviously also has to write down any sort of interventions, right? So data reviewed, no issues, no needs. Now you could say that, every single data point on every single day, you need to just make sure that you're saying in line with expectations, no needs, no changes. And then maybe say at one of the dates, maybe the readings were above, that you called the patient, what you discussed, what you decided. And you can even say, no, change in therapy at this time, continue monitoring, et cetera. You can also make sure at the end of the, full 14 days, or maybe it's a full month or 90 days worth of data, every month you're going to want to have kind of some summary that says, reviewed X number of blood pressure data, readings are within target range, no intervention are needed at this time. Or, maybe you called the patient and they reported feeling dizzy, blood pressure readings were 150/95, and then advised to recheck in and call back. And so again, it's that whole communication train that you need to talk through. Did you talk to them through a phone or through an EMR message portal? Basically, the MA is documenting every single one of this. So their documentation, the MA's documentation, is going to provide that framework. But of course, these must be reviewed and signed and dated by a actual physician who is going to be doing the billing, because that's going to be something that's critical for both medical necessity and make sure that you've got a clear oversight. Obviously, if the MA escalates an issue to the physician, you're going to want to make that note in the tracking sheet or in the clinical notes, so that you can say, hey, the physician decided to make a change in care plan, the physician contacted the patient, and then what happened. Even if the outcome is they didn't change anything, you just want to make sure that you're documenting all of that. Of course, we want to make sure that the physician is signing off on these logs and reviewing this data as well, even if it's at the end of the month. So even just a simple co-signature in the EMR demonstrates, again, that supervision. So some failure points that we have seen is missing or undocumented patient consent, big one here. Making sure that they understand that they could potentially have a copay. And so really having a standard consent form for every RPM patient scanned into their medical chart is really, really important. Obviously, insufficient time documentation is going to be a big one here, right? So say you just bill for 20 minutes and you just show that you had, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, but you don't actually hit that 20-minute mark, or the details or the documentation is, vague in terms of where you spent the time. That's going to be a red flag. So using some sort of system that automatically kind of sums up the time for you or documents start times and end times for any sort of documentation or review is going to be really, really critical. I do have to caution against, any sort of repetitive or copy pasted notes, right? Data reviewed, no issues found, for every patient every single day, because you are going to want to have some specific notes for the patient's data. And that that's not going to be consistent across all 100, patients if you were to doing a pilot for that. Obviously, you want to make sure that you're meeting the required 16-day rule for the CPT of 99454, and down billing if you don't hit that 16-day rule. So really important to make sure that you don't bill a 99454 unless, again, you hit that 16 days. Obviously, selecting the right RPM vendor is going to be critical. So if you are looking for a kind of a long-term partner, you're going to want to look for these key things, right? Can they integrate with your EMR? I do think non-negotiable long-term. Do they have a direct, API way to get data into your EMR? The answer is no. I mean, I don't know if it'd be a deal killer for me. I think it's just that it's going to make your workflow more painful. Obviously, you're going to want to see any sort of live demos of what this integration looks like in your EMR and how that workflow would look. And they can give you some recommendations on this. How are you going to chart this information in your EMR so that you're not having like manual logs sitting at someone's desk? Obviously, making sure devices are FDA cleared. Are they easy to use? Do the vendors have instructional videos that they give to the patient? How do they support you if you're going to be paying them, 50% of the device CPT code reimbursement? Then you want to make sure that they're making this as easy as possible. And then obviously, what level of support do they offer both for your practice as well as patients? Do they offer a patient support hotline to deal with device issues, or do you have to deal with that? Do they provide training for your staff or for the patients, or do you have to do all of that? And then obviously looking at per patient or per month fees, right? So are there setup costs? Can you negotiate those? Are there hidden fees for data storage or support? And you're going to want to get this all written out so that you can truly understand and do that business case, so that you really understand those device costs, so it's not cutting too much into your margins. Obviously, vendors who are promising guaranteed reimbursement, obviously nobody's going to be able to guarantee that. So just be wary of that. I would shy away from any sort of long-term contracts without a trial period, because you want to see if this works for your patients and your staff and billing, all the things. Obviously, having vendors who have references from practices similar to yours is always helpful. So those are just a few tidbits. I do want to call out, we have a patient AR playbook that we put out. You can head on over to natrevmd.com/ margin-playbook. And again, the links will be down below. So check that out. Just another way to kind of clean up some things here as we kick off into 2026. As always, hopefully this kind of outlines some ideas for you guys to increase revenue this year. It's always about these little things, but the little things add up. And again, you guys know I love process. I'm a big process person. Identifying what you want the process to look like. How can you set up standardized consent forms, standardized workflows, standardized checklists? How can you train your staff using, a Loom video or a Teams video so that you don't have to retrain somebody else who's going to be covering the next time? Again, the more things you can do in your practice to augment efficient training and efficient workflows, I just think you're setting yourself up for success. And then your brain can be working on either seeing patients if you see patients, running the practice if you're an office manager, or being the CEO and not having to retrain or rethink through process. So process is a huge, huge thing for you to focus on when it comes to this topic specifically. So hopefully this helps you guys if you are a practice collecting over $150,000 a month and would like to book a call with us to go through your billing metrics and do an audit. We would be happy to do that at natrevmd.com/ schedule a call, or that right hand corner, it says free revenue audit. Check it out and we're happy to help you out. All right. We will talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much.